What does BYOB, bring your own bottle to a restaurant, really mean? What special laws and etiquette do you need to know about it? Which provinces and states allow it? How does BYOB benefit you as a wine lover, aside from reducing your restaurant bill? And how should you calculate the tip when you bring your own wine? That's exactly what you'll learn on today's episode of the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 57. Well, Happy New Year! Did you ring in 2020 with some great wines last night? And if so, should I be whispering this podcast? I hope you had a wonderful holiday. And of course, it's not over yet. Miles and I went to Montreal for a couple of days, as we always do between Christmas and New Year's. We love walking around old Montreal and, of course, dining in the city's fabulous restaurants. And just a bit of braggy boots news here to share with you. Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes, featured this podcast as one of the best listens in 2019. Yay! Thank you for making it so by subscribing and reviewing this podcast. You keep me running on my little hamster wheel over here. Now, if you haven't yet joined my free online class, The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever, then just go to nataliemclean.com/class and pick a time and day that work for you. All right, let's dive into our topic today. So I'm going to dive into our first topic of bringing your own bottle of wine to a restaurant. There's a lot of emotions tied up in BYOB or BYOW, bring your own wine. I spent my, shall we say, early drinking years in Nova Scotia, so I've been trained to be very polite and select wine from a restaurant list. I used to think of it this way: I'd no more bring my own booze to a restaurant than I would my own cutlery or linen. However, when BYOB was finally legalized in Ontario, I decided to visit restaurants that allowed this practice. There are dedicated restaurants in Quebec that allow it. BC and Alberta do. And I know New York, New Jersey, California do. But it's a patchwork of provinces and states. I think BYOB is nirvana for people like me who love great wine and food, but who can't cook worth a damn. So I have lots of really good Bordeaux that I've been aging for a while, and they would languish beside soggy spaghetti or frozen pizza here at home. That's, of course, when Miles is not cooking, when I'm fending for myself. Miles, my partner, is a great cook, so not to disparage his efforts at all. Also, with BYOB, I really enjoy sipping on my wine while perusing the menu instead of having to wait 20 minutes for it to arrive or to even have to analyze the wine list in the first place. The thing I always do is I always offer my server or sommelier a glass of my wine, and often they'll take it back to the kitchen and share it. For me personally, sharing wine with the staff feels so much more wonderfully generous than just leaving a tip. Besides, you sort of get the benefit of everybody being happy midway through the meal, rather than just at the end where you leave the tip and leave, right? You get the actual benefit of your generosity midway through the meal. BYOB is a very common practice in Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. It's an entrenched part of dining culture, and I think the reason is that those countries often grew up with a wine culture, whereas in North America, Canada, and the US, we, in some respects, are still living in the shadow of Prohibition. And thus we have this legislative patchwork that reflects all the different liquor laws by state and province, but also a reticence to liberalize some of these ancient laws about alcohol. So I think the benefits to wine lovers are really obvious. We can add a personal touch to our meals, particularly when we want to bring a rare or mature bottle from our own cellars. Let's face it, most restaurants can't afford to keep inventory for 5 to 10 years to age a fine wine to when it best suits food. We as diners can complement our food choices by bringing several half bottles, which are a relative rarity on most wine lists. And then these can go with different courses, or for those times when you want fish and your dining partner wants steak. Also, I find, and I'm going to generalize here, but in Asian, Thai, and Indian restaurants, which are outstanding cuisine, they're often not known for outstanding wine lists. Again, because I think that those cultures didn't develop around a winemaking culture. So I think that when wine lovers can bring wine specifically to suit those spicy and exotic flavors, think off-dry Riesling or your Torrontés, I think it's, again, a big win all round. I think BYOB gives diners more choice in restaurants that specialize in one particular region or style. So you may love French cuisine and agree that the restaurant's French wines complement their cuisine, but what if you're a die-hard fan of Australian Shiraz? So I think that's another situation where BYOB works really well. And then, what about pizza joints and roadside diners? Just because you're eating casual fare doesn't mean the wine has to be plonk. And diners with special dietary or religious needs might prefer to drink their own trusted organic or kosher or vegan wines. But I think we have to face the issue. The main draw for bring your owners is economic, not gustatory, at least at first. Diners see it as a way to avoid overpriced restaurant wines. There'd be little support for this initiative if they felt that markups were more reasonable. Some restaurants do add as much as 200 to 300% markup on wines. Robert Parker, the powerful, now retired U.S. critic, once described prices, restaurant wine prices, as, quote, the legitimized mugging of consumers, end quote. I think this is especially true for higher-priced wines. Even today's savvy diners, a lot of us may lack an understanding when we see a bottle on a list that we haven't tried before. How much is it? Because restaurants will try to offer you wines you can't buy in the liquor store. That's a plus. It's a new taste experience. But as a result, we're really not savvy about the markup, but we're very aware of the price of chicken, and how much that chicken dish is marked up. The fact is, though, that alcohol is usually about a third of the restaurant's revenue, and it represents much more in profit, sometimes as much as half. The adage in the industry is customers will eat you poor and drink you rich. So we have to keep in mind that restaurants, through the alcohol prices, are covering their costs, their food costs, their service costs, their overhead costs. I think the most common markup in Toronto is 3 times LCBO cost. Although the percentage markup on pricey wines is usually lower than for less pricey wines, the final price is still substantial. For example, if a bottle of wine sells for $100 in the store, it might be priced at $150 on the list, a 50% markup, but it still translates to an extra $50 on the bill. But at the low end, where the markup percentages are greatest, wine lovers have good reason, I think, to be wary. A wine that costs $20 on a list is probably sold for somewhere between $7 and $10 retail, which can be a hit and miss category for quality. Profit margins on food and restaurants generally have always been very thin. It's the main reason why 80% of restaurants or new restaurants go out of business in their first year. So I think we have to cut them some slack from that perspective. Most restaurants make back on booze what they lose on food, so an average of 100% markup is considered reasonable. This is why BYOB won't work unless restaurants can either increase their food prices or charge a corkage fee or both. Corkage is when the restaurant pulls the cork for you. The fee is added to your bill to pay for the establishment's glassware, decanters, cleaning, bottle disposal, lost profits and service because you're not buying their wine, including topping up wages for staff for lost tips on a meal with no wine sold. But to be fair, you should base tipped on what the bill would have been had the bottle been from the restaurant, since it's just as much work for your server to pour your wine as theirs. In fact, I liken it to if you get your bill at the end and you don't tip based on what the total bill would be, it's like buying a car with no gas money. It's just cheap. So calculate your tip based on if that bottle you had brought with you had been on the restaurant list, how much would it have cost, and therefore how much should your tip be? Corkage fees can vary widely from $10 to as high as $100 or more at fancy restaurants in New York City, like Jean-Georges. The restaurants that charge the highest fees are often those who have made significant investments in their cellars, and they really don't want to encourage BYOB. Corkage is often calculated as a flat fee per table or a charge per bottle or person, since there's more effort in opening and pouring 5 bottles for a table of 10 people than there is for 1 bottle for a table of 2. Some base the fee on the cheapest bottle on their own list, or twice the cost of wine by the glass from their own list. And some will waive the fee if you order a bottle from their list as well as drinking your own, which I always find is a good practice. So even if you are going to have your own bottle, we like to start off with buying a glass of wine from the restaurant list. I just think it's a nicety to warm things up and put smiles back on the faces of the servers. Or, have your bottle and maybe order a dessert wine or spirit or something to finish off the meal from the restaurant list. Now, here's a cautionary tale from Napa Valley, the famous French Laundry restaurant. They started charging a $30 corkage fee, but they failed to cover their costs. Diners would bring in wines, of course, from the local wineries, or even cheap bottles left at their hotel rooms as welcome gifts. Before the restaurant raised the corkage fee to $50, it lost $100,000 in wine sales, if you can imagine. Even if charging corkage doesn't make up the entire profit shortfall, the resulting higher volume of business might, especially in lean economic times. So the practice might encourage people not to give up dining out completely, and thereby keeping, I think, what is a vital restaurant culture alive. It would also make dining out more affordable for those on really tight budgets, like college students, seniors on a fixed income, young families, obscure poets. Even well-off diners might order more courses and pricier entrees when the wine doesn't loom so large on the bill. I think people might dine out more often, too, if there was BYOB, especially on nights that are traditionally less profitable for restaurants, like weekday evenings. Some restaurants encourage this by offering BYOB only, say, from Monday to Thursday, or only on Sundays and Mondays. Otherwise, on other nights, especially high-traffic nights, diners must order wines from the house list. Some restaurants in wine country don't charge corkage fees if diners bring in wine bought locally. It's their way of encouraging the regional industry. And in turn, the wineries send business their way, advising visitors which restaurants to patronize with their bottles. I think that's really important for emerging wine regions like Ontario. I'm not sure I should say emerging anymore. For, well, how should we describe it? Not mature, not emerging, but teenage, young adult wine regions. Small wineries in these regions often don't have the volume to get their product into provincial liquor stores. They can't stock those massive chains. Instead, they have to rely on direct sales and visitors and on the services of wine agents to sell their wines. In fact, small producers from around the world depend on wine importers and agents to sell directly to restaurants. So any change that allows diners to bring wines into restaurants would be helpful to them. Whatever the scenario, I think flexibility is really critical. Restaurants have to be able to choose whether they offer diners BYOB and their own wine list or both, rather than being forced by law to pick one or the other, as is in the case of Quebec right now. They should be able to choose which nights and which meals can be BYOB and set their own corkage fees. Some new establishments adopt BYOB because the license required isn't as expensive or time-consuming to secure as a full liquor license, so they don't have to spend the cash up front to establish a wine cellar, and it allows small restaurants to compete on food alone with well-funded restaurants that can afford a wine list. Some opponents to BYOB raise concerns about customers drinking too much of their own wine, but existing laws already give restaurateurs protection in dealing with drunken patrons. It doesn't matter whose alcohol they're drinking. And I think logic tells us that situation is likely to work the other way. Diners are going to feel less obligated to drink a whole bottle of wine when they've only paid retail cost for it, and that they should be permitted to take home what they don't drink, recorked in the trunk of their car, unless, of course, you're making the gracious gesture of leaving unconsumed wine for the staff. So rather than encouraging drunkenness, allowing diners to bring their own wine to a restaurant makes dining out more a part of our culture. And I think one benefit is that it will raise knowledge about wine and appreciation of it. Diners who don't know much about wine might be more motivated to learn more about wine online or from experts who offer wine courses, when they're not under pressure to choose quickly from a restaurant list. They can take their time, select the bottle that they want to bring. And then, of course, there's the awkwardness of two couples trying to decide on what they both like and can afford and trying to have this guessing game about price and budget and taste. So I think bring your own wine is more about making wine more part of our dining culture. It's not about ripping off servers or driving restaurants out of business. Back in the 1970s, if you recall, I read this, I researched this, it was illegal to stand up and drink in restaurants. Only a waiter could move your drink from one table to another, and your food bill had to exceed your wine bill on Sundays. So I think it's high time that we come into the post-prohibition era where we can bring wine to a restaurant. Speaking of wine, getting super thirsty. So I'm drinking a Pinot Noir from Rose Hall Run. I actually haven't had a sip since we started because I've been talking nonstop. So good. Actually, I had some BYOB etiquette to share with you. I think you'll find this useful beyond the tips we've talked about so far. Let me just share my quick tips. So even when you know BYOB is legal, check that the restaurant allows for it. In Ontario, they can decide which nights, which meals, and so on. So always call ahead. And when you make the reservation, ask if you can bring a special bottle to celebrate your birthday, even if it was months ago and you've been celebrating it every week since. Even if you don't get a flat out no, you may sense some resistance on the phone or a corkage fee that is really high. Really, they're signaling that they don't want to do it. And remember, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's mandatory. The restaurants can decide what kind of service they want to offer. Sometimes a restaurant will have no problem if you bring one bottle to drink, but they will look askance at 2, 3, or a case. Still, when we go to a restaurant, it's been so long since I've done this, but now I'm motivated too to try this again, but we'd always bring 2 bottles in case one was corked or faulty, because what are you going to do? Send it back? You brought it. But we would keep the spare under the table in a nice bag. Please, no paper bags, no grocery bags. Find something chic. Go to your local accessory store. You also obviously don't want to take a wine that is really fragile or old and can't be jostled in the car. You want something that's fairly resilient and can stand up to being moved around. Don't take your best wines to restaurants that have poor glassware, or it's going to be death by little golf ball glasses. Some people take their own stemware too. They come with a full case. Several half bottles are always a great idea so that you can pair by the course. Also, if you're bringing a wine, make sure it's not one that the restaurant already offers on its list. Exception only, you've got a rare old vintage of the wine, because it's like arriving to Thanksgiving dinner with your own turkey. Don't do it. So if they already offer that wine on the list, don't bring the same wine. Let's see what else. Avoid homemade wine unless you are an award-winning amateur. Please do not skip the homemade wine. Often, BYOB refers only to wine. So spirits, beer, and fortified wines may be discouraged or even illegal. So you want to make sure that you're bringing the right beverage, wine. You might want to consider buying an insulated wine case, especially if you're bringing rosé, bubbly, or white that has to stay chilled. Maybe has some compartments. Let's see, what else can I advise you to find? Some restaurants, more formal restaurants, will want to store your wine out in the back. Just make sure there's no mix-ups. Of course, if they mix it up with their Petrus, who cares? Even if you bring your own wine, especially if it's a fancier restaurant, I'd still let the server top up your glass rather than you just helping yourself. Go with what the typical service etiquette would be, as if you had bought the wine off the list. Also, final tip, we don't want to use restaurants as cheap places to drink where, we only order a little bit of food or a bit of a tapas and then drinking lots of our own wine. So there you have it. All right, let me just give you a few quick tips on chain restaurants. So I think most chain restaurants don't use their wine list to attract customers. It's more quick, inexpensive, consistent food with big name beer, usually on tap, and a casual ambiance. But I was writing and researching an article about chain restaurant wine lists. And so my quest for wine in the land of Greece led me to visit 43 restaurants, and then my doctor for a cholesterol check. But my question was, do diners really want Petrus with their pizza? Probably not. How many P's can you say in one sentence? Last year, a research group said that 2/3 of Canadians eat or ate in casual franchises at least once every 2 months, spending more than $7.5 billion. But with all those meals, only 7% of us ordered wine. So why is that when a good glass of wine can make fried chicken taste even better? Not to mention slow service seem faster and country music actually sound good. I'm kidding about that last one. I think there's some fabulous country music. So I think there's a number of reasons, but service and selection really stand out, both from a cultural clash, the worlds of good wine and fast food. So slow versus fast, I think unique versus consistent, and small versus large. I think the biggest beef against wine lists is selection, or rather lack thereof when it comes to chains. So usually there's the house red and the house white, and many lists I've found are filled with wines better for cooking. Then again, what wines pair well with MSG ketchup or those mysterious dipping sauces? I'm coming off as a total snob here. So when I was researching this article, my waitress, Jenny, she bounced over to the table and she announced that there were 2 wines, a red and a white. And then she added that the Chardonnay was to keep the ladies happy. But I do think that several chains do offer good lists. So I mentioned the Keg, Earl's restaurants in Western Canada. I think they actually have franchises here in Ontario now, offer 30 wines. All are offered by the glass. None is marked up by more than a modest fee. They also have neck tags that have tasting notes that the patrons can take home. Olive Garden sells 5 million bottles of wine a year. When guests arrive on Friday or Saturday evenings, they're offered a complimentary glass of Pinot Grigio or Chianti while they wait for their table, just as the owner of a trattoria in the old country might give regulars a sip on the wine on the house. Since this initiative was launched 2 years ago, more than 18 million guests have sampled wine while they wait. Training young staff on wine service can always be a challenge, but at Canyon Creek, within 6 months of joining, this is a Toronto chop house, steakhouse, servers are required to write a test set by the Wine Council of Ontario, and if they pass, they get an expense-paid visit to several Niagara wineries. That's brilliant. Let me also note a few other things. As chain restaurants face increased competition, many are differentiating their dining experience with branded products like Starbucks coffee, Toblerone chocolate bars, or decent wines. They're also working with professional chefs in their test kitchens to develop signature dishes. So this kind of goes hand in glove with that. But I still think it'll take a cultural shift for us to associate good wine with chain restaurants. In the meantime, I think we should reward chain or casual restaurants that do offer good wines, whether we're wearing bow ties or blue jeans. Got any favorite restaurants that have phenomenal restaurant wine lists? I'm heading over to my private Facebook group for my course students, and I am finally going to launch my free new webinar, The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever. But right now, I am going over to, as I said, my private group. We're doing a tasting of holiday wines, which wines to give as gifts. Thank you, and bye for now. Take care. Well, there you have it. You'll find links to my latest wine reviews, the video version of this discussion, and a link so that you can sign up for my free wine class in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/57. If you liked this episode, please tell a friend about it, especially one who's interested in learning about the etiquette of BYOB. My podcast is easy to find whether you search Google on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. You can also find me on Facebook or Twitter at Natalie MacLean, and on Instagram I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemaclean.com/class. I can't wait to share more wine stories with you next week. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this one. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a terrific wine that you bring to a restaurant near you. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.